Hello, happy to be here. My name is Elyse Smith. I am a first-year PhD student in medical and environmental anthropology at the University of Connecticut. But before this, I studied bioethics and the medical humanities. So today I'll be discussing psychedelic drug policy from the perspective of bioethics and bioethical principlism in particular. So to begin, I want us to just remember this pretty important underlying consideration, which is that the vast majority of psychedelics users are part of and therefore cannot be entirely disentangled from a criminalized subculture. And this includes the researchers, the students, the integration therapists, and other psychedelic practitioners, most of the community's use, and much of what has intimately inspired the whole psychedelic renaissance that we recognize today. Most of it has thus far occurred within the context of prohibition. So then if we think of the current landscape of legal psychedelic availability, there are exemptions for ceremonial use in some religious groups, and decriminalization is actually already enacted in some individual jurisdictions across the country. But so amidst the whole burgeoning clinical research paradigm and all the community-based drug policy reform movements, three major possibilities for psychedelics rescheduling are on the horizon: decriminalization, legalization, and full kind of institutionalized medicalization. Today I'll be discussing mainly psychedelic decriminalization, or decrim for short, and what I mean by that specifically is removing criminal penalties for low-level drug and drug paraphernalia use and possession, releasing nonviolent drug offenders, and expunging their past offenses. And I'm speaking mainly within the US context here. So some current debates are critically examining the ethical viability of those three reform approaches, their mutual exclusivity and their potential coexistence. And in grappling with the many psychosocial, biopolitical, and structural factors and stakes at play in the whole psychedelic renaissance, bioethical analysis, and specifically bioethical principlism, I think offers a pretty valuable kind of cohesive framework through which to really consider the potential benefit maximization and harm reduction specifically implicated in psychedelics rescheduling. So then what is bioethical principlism? Well, it's a normative ethical framework, a common morality approach for practical decision making in healthcare through a process of achieving reflective equilibrium. So how do we use it then? Well, we confront dilemmas with the balanced, specified, and contextualized application of four core principles in no particular order here, but those are beneficence, which is doing good for others, non-maleficence, which is not harming others, or choosing the least worst option, and then respect for autonomy, also known as respect for persons, which is individuals' freedom and choice, and justice, which can broadly be understood to include distribution of material and social goods, rights, and terms of cooperation. So today I am presenting an argument for psychedelic decrim using a framework which closely considers these four core ethical kind of pillars that comprise the principlist approach to resolving bioethical dilemmas, with at least one potential exception, which I will briefly touch upon later. So moving into the first principle, beneficence, doing good for others, I see this represented by psychedelics' various potential benefits and that their access can bring to society for various applications like public mental health, for instance, and spirituality, and even personal and cultural nourishment, that I call it, under ideal, appropriate conditions and circumstances, of course. So with regards to biopsychosocial health, this is explored much more in depth by my colleagues in the clinical realm and the clinical track of psychedelic, but just some major examples of some indications where psychedelics are applicable here are treatment-resistant PTSD and depression, and end-of-life anxiety, and a whole range of substance use disorders. So in speaking of spirituality and just other broader use, there are indigenous traditions of sacred healing across the millennia and across the world. And now there are even these psychedelic churches as sort of Western correlates where they are decriminalized. For example, in Oregon right now, where this House of Jasiri mushroom church is. And there are other contexts of underground spiritual exploration. And mystical experiences are also considered by many to mediate therapeutic action, in that they can facilitate peace and acceptance and reduce existential dread, They can stimulate interconnection and communion with others. And there was the original Johns Hopkins study where psilocybin induced these kind of profoundly meaningful mystical experiences in healthy volunteers. So we see this in extra clinical context as well. Yeah, psychedelics can create and enhance a lot of life meaning and more in naturalistic or recreational users. And there are community anecdotes of this on Arrowhead and other online forums, and really just across the generations. And we also see benefits of creativity and learning and philosophical and scientific inquiry into consciousness. And all of this can really contribute to health ultimately. So moving into non-maleficence then, which is the call to do no harm and choose the least worst option in this policy dilemma, which would be between option A, which is perpetuating the damage to human and societal functioning that may be caused at least in part by psychedelic prohibition and restriction, versus, on the other hand, option B, which would be really working to build a framework to depenalize and conscientiously support the social integration of psychoactive substances, which can be profoundly helpful tools, but are widely stigmatized and potentially harmful. So then, in tandem with prohibition, and of course the many intersectional and intergenerational harms of drug-related incarceration, the sort of fully demonizing and blindly stigmatizing propaganda like the DARE program tended to produce a couple key effects by painting this wholly incomplete picture of drugs in general. But first, it both conceptually denies and physically restricts the very real, profound benefits that everyday people have derived from these substances, as described in my last section. And so if we are aiming for a balanced drug policy analysis, then both harms and benefits must be considered and properly contextualized. An important factor here is that our collective set and setting that propagates this anti-drug cultural rhetoric and alienating stigma can also produce these needlessly damaging, and that is challenging or outright harmful or even traumatizing effects on what could otherwise be very positive and personally meaningful psychedelic experiences. So second, the stigma and prohibition ironically dangerously obscures and therefore actually exacerbates the equally real and specific causes of potential harm in psychedelic users. So for example, there are drug interactions and contraindications, underlying conditions, and a potential psychedelics user on SSRIs or another psychotropic medication is left with little accessible information on possible interactions, and therefore might unintentionally proceed sort of without caution. And another really unfortunate example is that there's this desperation and the threat of incarceration within a criminalized subculture. It can create a range of exploitative power differentials between users and providers, which users may even realistically have more reason to worry about than even developing a psychotic reaction or HPPD. But of course, these kinds of harms that I highlight here are really sorely underemphasized in mainstream psychedelic drug user education resources. So then what is the bigger harm here? I think that, and it appears that the primary harm really may be full prohibition itself, or option A from earlier, because the stalling and underdevelopment of even basic safety research resulting from the Controlled Substances Act has restricted information from the general public, which has also perpetuated this insidiously dangerous stigmatization, which further restricts the conversations and becomes this clearly cyclical kind of compounding dynamic, making the work involved in anti-prohibition overall the least worst option, I would think. So moving into autonomy, I envision autonomy or respect for persons as the protection of an individual's cognitive liberty and the freedom that psychedelics can sort of potentiate to cognitively emancipate oneself from certain culturally hegemonic assumptions or dominant discourses. And foundational bioethicists Beecham and Childress have delineated a few kind of a few conditions that are essential for autonomy. And these are agency, liberty, and intentionality, and understanding and freedom from controlling influences that determine action. We'll see how this is relevant here in just a moment. But in terms of cognitive liberty, this has been a sort of core feature of many anti-prohibition arguments. It's seen as this innate human right to explore and alter one's own consciousness, and it's consistent with bodily autonomy, the ability to control one's own body and health. And this is essential for the human right to health, of course. But we see these themes of kind of banned thought production that could be compared almost to the prohibited book list, or the banned text, for example, within some highly restrictive religions and governmental regimes historically. And there's also the First Amendment that's important here, because if you think about it, we can't really fully utilize or realize all of the rights protected within our First Amendment if we don't have the freedom of thought. But for example, the European Convention on Human Rights actually does explicitly protect the freedom of thought, yet we still do see this kind of biopolitical control of unorthodox cognitive states for whatever reason that might be. So then the thought is that cognitive liberty could possibly challenge the forces of cultural hegemony. And this is the control or domination of the dominant class over the subordinate or subaltern classes through consent rather than brute force. And this has been described as a situation where one major concept of reality, and that is, morality, a set of customs, and political principles even, is sort of diffused throughout society through the many ways in which the institutions of civil society operate to kind of shape directly or indirectly the cognitive and sort of affective structures whereby people perceive and evaluate problematic social reality. And so psychedelics are definitely not antidotes to this, but perhaps they may act as partial counteragents in that they can kind of facilitate a critical meta-awareness and internal reappraisal of the effects of some of these dynamics within people. So for example, there's the pretty common and really widely rewarded assertion of unrelenting entrepreneurialism and aggressively individualist pursuits. But this can be placed in pretty stark contrast with a psychedelically induced internal recognition of and maybe a renewed commitment to our community and ecological interdependence, reflections and orientations that are empirically shown to be more conducive to biopsychosocial and environmental health as well. And another example here is that with psychedelics, we may be able to become more aware of any historical and institutional trauma we might have. And by maybe beginning to develop a kind of class consciousness, we can hopefully start to socially demand systemic accountability for some of this structural oppression, and hopefully eventually move into a space of healing and even self-definition. So then what I conclude from these observations is that with regard to those essential conditions for autonomy mentioned earlier, the agency, liberty, intentionality, and understanding, freedom from controlling influences, psychedelic prohibition restricts or even effectively eliminates these conditions, whereas psychedelic decrim effectively supports them. So then, in terms of justice, first, I just want to say that, without diminishing the very primary importance of obtaining material and legal restitution and substantive social justice, especially in the oppressed socioeconomic classes that are statistically the most impacted by drug prohibition and the drug war, of course. My basic premise here with regard to psychedelics is that experiential autonomy, a kind of non-material social good and right, with access to it kind of distributed under psychedelic decrim, could be considered one small yet potentially significant partial form of reparations or reparative justice in the process of cognitively healing and almost emancipating ourselves through free, safe, and effective means, especially considering some pretty major institutional transgressions, such as systemic trauma and injustice against cognitive self-determination itself, and against individual and collective health, health and against the environment on which our well-being is intimately dependent. And current drug policy regimes, they do two major things here. They first protect institutional abuses of power, which have, of course, contributed heavily to massive epidemics of diseases of despair, such as substance dependence, and the opioid epidemic, other what have been described as corporation-induced diseases, for example, with Purdue Pharma. But simultaneously, they also fully prohibit and or at least heavily restrict and criminalize most illegitimate, quote unquote, illegitimate drug use. So therefore, they fundamentally violate bodily autonomy and thus the human right to health. And so in this situation, drug prohibition can be seen as an illegal act committed by the government, where the state has failed to uphold its obligations set forth by the United Nations International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to health that is protected within that. And the federal government here is actually both the judge and the accused. So then in order to kind of reconcile that situation, the only real viable response we may have is to pursue movement from a focus on crime and legal punishment to one of justice and moral reparations, since we can't really punish the government very effectively, at least. And so, yeah, structural violence and suppression of cognitive freedom from the state really warrants a kind of restoration of respect and dignity, for example, in helping to repair and promote our maybe autonomous creation of social and environmental meaning, awareness, and action, an undertaking perhaps applicable to psychedelic exploration and healing. So then what I conclude from all this is that the prospects of beneficence and non-maleficence really warrant autonomy to heal ourselves, explore consciousness, pursue spirituality, break free from cultural hegemony, which would serve as reparative justice from dominant institutions whose power really does materially control much of our individual and collective well-being. So just some implications from all of this is that, first of all, using this bioethical principlist framework can support grassroots political organizers in achieving psychedelic decrim in the general public, whose opinion is already shifting away from prohibition, by the way, overall anyway. But crucially, it can and must also be used to prioritize a kind of socio-historical contextualization of indigenous sovereignty, or really lack thereof, actually, in plant medicine regulation and policy, which may fundamentally alter these policy resolutions. And here, all four of the principles actually may fundamentally alter the decriminalization resolution, specifically with regards to peyote, in that they may come together to actually oppose, the principles may come together to actually oppose psychedelic decrim. So in this context, it really warrants the centering of indigenous community voices and needs in these policymaking conversations, a topic for perhaps a whole additional presentation, but definitely worthy of much further consultation and research, which I'm actually beginning to explore on the ground this summer. But with regards to other psychedelic substances, we can contextualize several practical ongoing implications and tensions that kind of emerge out of policy resolutions just by looking at the rather unique example of Oregon. And if I had time today, from here, I would ideally discuss a proposed interdisciplinary on-the-ground anthropological and psychiatric epidemiological investigation into Oregon State's convergence and perhaps divergence between their all-drug decriminalization, Measure 110, and their psilocybin services semi-medicalized legalization, Measure 109 there. And again, with more time, I would ideally dive into, I would actually dive into these issues much more deeply, but there are various bioethical principlist questions that this unique policy backdrop raises with regard to, first, potential harm and access problems in both the generally legal and the more specifically clinical, commercialized, and commodified psychedelic market. And second, there are additional concerns of bifurcated drug scheduling, so continued criminalization and maybe even increased stigmatization of extra clinical users. And there are also varieties of psychedelic exceptionalism that are highlighted here, of course, especially within a purely medicalized model of psychedelic, of legal access. And many further questions and dilemmas remain. That's all I have time for today. I'm already over time, but I greatly encourage and really invite any and all discussion of these important ethical issues. So I provided my contact info there. But yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for listening.